Okay, one and all, thank you very much for coming along today to what is the last CAR seminar for the semester, but certainly not least. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose unceded traditional lands we meet today, virtually and physically, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Adeleye from our very own School of Culture, History and Language, who will be talking about his ongoing PhD research into changes in vegetation bioregimes in the Bass Strait of Southeast Australia over the last 35,000 years in response to climatic and sea level changes, as well as human landscape use. As a very brief introduction before I hand over, Matthew completed a BSc in Environmental Botany, Palaeoecology at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. During this time, he also worked as an Environmental Impact Assessment Officer and investigated airborne pollutants on the university campus. Matthew later moved to Canada, where he completed an MSc in Palaeoecology and Forest Biology at the University of Victoria. Here he documented changes in forest composition of central Vancouver Island over the past 14,000 years, which is an incredibly rugged island. In 2019, he took up a PhD here at ANU to expand on this research with a focus on the Sahel continent. Without further ado, Matthew, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you.
Just get what we have here.
Share the screen. Right.
Oh. This one. Here goes.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. And today I'll be sharing a series of my PhD findings. I hope doesn't bother you all. And before I commence, as you can see, my PhD is focused on the changes in ecosystems in Southeast Australia in the past and how we can use that to inform management decisions. And using the Bass Strait as a major area of focus, and I will be talking about the reason why I actually picked Bass Strait, or why Bass Strait was picked as a center of focus. So before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I live and work in the land of the Ngambri, and a lot of people, and my samples from Bass Strait were collected from the Tiwana and Pakana, the land of Tiwana and Pakana indigenous people, and some of the data I'll be referring to were drawn from other Southeast Australian regions. So, I pay my respects to the past and the present elders in this traditional lands. Yeah, so global change. We know that the Earth systems have been undergoing major changes since industrial revolution, be it the atmosphere, the sea, including landscape use, in terms of human activities, what they are doing with different ecosystems. And these changes are not only significantly impacting ecosystems, they are now posing threats to our lives as well. As we can see in the last bushfire, the summer 2020 bushfire in Southeast Australia, and we can also see something similar in California in 2020. And of course, the most recent one, the flooding in New South Wales. So all these things are impacting our lives, at the same time impacting ecosystems. So, and contemporary ecologists have tried to actually identify a way to ameliorate these changes through time. And recent studies have now found that understanding the ecosystem, changes in ecosystem within a short time frame might not be actually reliable to base a management approach. What I'm saying in essence is that using the last bushfire in Southeast Australia as a yardstick for management might not be realistic or effective, considering the amount of time required for vegetation or for climatic effects to actually accumulate and cause those changes that we are seeing today. So there is need for a much more long-term, robust ecological data, which is what my PhD is going to be providing for Southeast Australia. And of course, with the knowledge of that, of long-term ecosystem changes and present changes, we can identify some potential changes that might actually occur in the future, which will guide management decisions in Southeast Australia. And such long-term ecosystem changes in form management have now been championed in other parts of the world, including South America, Canada, and so on and so forth. But it's still kind of limited in Australia, especially the southeast region here, where destructive fires are now becoming the norm rather than the exception. And this long-term ecological or paleoecological data can be drawn from pollen records, charcoal, as well as non-pollen palynomorphs, and so on and so forth, including ancient DNA and stable isotope. But my PhD focus on pollen, charcoal, and non-pollen palynomorphs. So when I say non-pollen palynomorphs, I mean algal remains, fungal remains, protists, and so on and so forth. So this boils down to the aim of my thesis, to build a robust baseline, long-term ecological change baseline for Southeast Australia to allow implications for management using the Bass Strait Island as a major study site or study area. So why choose the Bass Strait? So on other parts of Southeast Australia, which is Southeast Australia mainland and Tasmania, people have occupied those regions for many thousands of years, and continual use of the landscape makes it difficult to tease apart the influence of humans from the influence of climate on the landscape or on ecosystems. Whereas in Bass Strait, archaeological records suggest that from about 5,000 years ago, human activities actually declined on this island. So it kind of presents us with the opportunity to actually tease apart a little bit what people and climate were actually doing on the landscape in the past. So just a little bit about the Bass Strait area. Of course, it's in the southeast part of Australia between the mainland and Tasmania, and it was formed between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago when sea level reached maximum. And major vegetation types on the islands include heathland and some patches of eucalyptus woodland. And the major climatic drivers on the island include the El Nino and Anna, Southern Anna mode. So the Southern Anna mode, or SAM, is the oscillation, the northern and southern movement of the southern westerly winds in the southeastern part of Australia, as well as the Indian Ocean dipole, which not only influence climate on the island, but also in Southeast Australia in general. Okay, so in 2019/2020, so we embarked on a journey to Palaeoecology Island using, of course, a car, okay, and a boat. And we collected sediment cores from about 11 sites to understand the past vegetation history on the island, as well as fire regimes and lake level changes. So we subjected the sediment cores to radiocarbon dates or radiocarbon analysis to build a chronology for the sediment cores, and as well analyze the pollen and non-pollen palynomorphs to reconstruct past regional and local vegetation history, as well as lake history, and also analyze the charcoal to reconstruct the past fire activity on the island. And this record was then compared to independent record of climate, sea level, and human occupation to understand the links between vegetation, climate, sea level, people, fire, and so on and so forth. So for the lab analysis, the first step was to build a chronology for the sediment cores, and how that is done is we grab the sediment cores and we subsample and subject the subsamples to radiocarbon dating by sending them to one of the labs in the US, and they also do it like ANU. And once the dates come back, we then use it to build an agent model where we can use the known depths to actually identify the ages of the unknown depths. And for pollen analysis, the first thing we do, we subsample and then we see the material, so just remove stones and some other large particles, so to concentrate the pollen. And we also have some chemicals to actually remove carbonate and to remove the jackets on the pollen, which is called pollen kits or pollen jackets. So Removing that will allow us to actually see the features of each pollen, and then we can identify them under the microscope. And from the pollen data, we can then use different statistical software to actually do some statistics on the pollen data, just to compress the dimension of the data. And for charcoal analysis, we also sieve with a larger sieve, 125 micrometer and 250 micrometer. And then we bleach to just make other things on the petri dish a little bit lighter, leaving the charcoal to be darker. And then we can count and use the data, also subject the data to statistical analysis as well. Okay, so the cores the sediment cores that we actually collected on Cape Island and Bass Strait actually span the last 35,000 years, and these are some of the pollen grains that were recorded, as well as the MPVs, which include algal, fungal, and small animal remains. So the first results, this record here spans the last 35,000 years, which include the last glacial maximum, and it shows that the Bass Strait, which was a land bridge at this time, around 29,000, from about 29,000, the land bridge was fully formed, at least based on the estimate of this result. It showed that the vegetation on the land bridge actually switched from an eucalyptus woodland to a grassy landscape at this time. And the Bayesian change point analysis, which I conducted here, showed that the vegetation shift at this time is actually significant. And it also is consistent with global changes in climate around this time, global changes in sea level and ice volume. So that was when sea level actually kind of reached minimum around this time. And it's also consistent with vegetation shift in other southern hemisphere sites, which include New Zealand and southern Chile, so part of South African Cape. So it's more or less reflecting what actually happened globally around this period. So even though the vegetation shift on the Bass Strait actually reflect a global significance or a global signal, the major or the maximum aridity on the Bass Strait actually happened between about 25 and 18,000 years ago. As you can see here, with the abundance of sedimentacea, which actually prefer shallow lakes, and the abundance of myriophyllum, which are typical of low level environments. And also not just the vegetation. So before 29,000 years ago, when the landscape was woody on the Basha land, we had a lot of fire activity going on. So the biomass availability around this time would have allowed a lot of fires. And of course, indigenous people were already settled in Tasmania around this time, and the whole movement process from the mainland to Tasmania would have also included some fire activities going on. And after the decline in fire activity, after 29,000 years ago, with expansion of grassland, may actually not only reflect the fact that there were not a lot of wood or woodland on the landscape to actually burn, but also it could actually reflect a major change in indigenous activities around this time, trying to adapt to the new grassland environment and the Bashan language. Okay, so that's between for the last glacier, and for the late glacier and the Holocene, which covers the last 14,000 years. So here the major change is that there was a shift from open eucalyptus woodland to a closed woodland and then to heathland and scrub. So the yellow indicates grass, and the gray shaded ones are woodland, forest, or scrub, that is taller vegetation, while the orange ones are heathland, that is shrubland or shrub vegetation that is actually less than 2 meters tall. So as you can see here, there was a lot of grass, which probably indicates the woodland was still open at that time. And then from about 13,000 years ago, as grass started to decline, we know that the woodland became actually denser. And from about 9,000 years ago, as you can see, from Big Reedy here, which is the longest record. So this record only covers the last 7,000 years, which is the top bit here, and this only covers the last 700 years. So this is like the main gap here. So from about 9,000, as you can see, 9 to 8,000, there was a major shift in vegetation, and that is summarized here. So there was a major shift in vegetation from a woodland crop to a typical heathland environment or heathland vegetation. And we found out using a DCA analysis that sea level was the major driver of vegetation change around this time. So as the highland became, because the highland is small and is definitely sensitive to sea level changes. So as the island became smaller, woodland started to retreat, especially on the coast, and we had this erosion vegetation taking over on the island. And from about 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, you can see that there's a lot of grays here, a lot of grays here. It shows that as sea level started to recede gradually, not significantly, just a little bit, then the taller vegetation started to expand again on Kebaran Island. And not just Kebaran Island, we saw similar trend on Flinders Island, other parts of Bass Strait Island, as well as the east coast of Tasmania. Okay. So now focusing on heathland expansion during the Holocene. So why heathland? So heathland are kind of unique ecosystem. They are low shrubby, and they have these cultural values because in Europe, they emerged as a result of people using fire to manage the landscape, and as well as agricultural activities for many thousands of years, I think, from about 7,000 years ago. So they are not just a vegetation that emerged as a result of climate, so they are also a kind of human footprint, a way to actually remember that there were people many thousand years ago using this landscape. So that's why they are really significant. And this ecosystem are actually now depleting in Australia, which is why we also focus on understanding what actually drove their development in the past and how to maintain them in the future. So based on those results, it was found that probably because sea level was the major driver between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago when sea level reached maximum. So it means on the island, if sea level should increase in the future, you would see the expansion of this heathland again. But we have no power over sea level, we can't control sea level, but we can control fire to some certain extent. And as you can see here, that when fire activity was actually high, that the heathland also expanded because as the taller vegetation were trying to take over the heathland, people were there using fire to actually suppress taller vegetation to maintain shrubby vegetation. And it shows that in the future, if similar fire frequencies also practiced, might be used to also promote heathland vegetation on the island. And as you can see here, as fire activity declined, also heathland declined, even though if fire wasn't the primary cause of heathland, but it was contributing to heathland development in the past. Okay, so that's about the terrestrial vegetation. So now talking about lake levels in Bass Strait. So this is based on wetland polling and non-polling polynomals. And we found that in Bass Strait that the wetland was actually drier during the late glacier and became wetter in the early Holocene between about 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, and then gradually became drier again. And these are the indicator species that actually reflect these changes in water regime in the wetland. And here we can see that climate was playing a role. So here is the water level changes in wetland. And here we have the climatic phases based on previous studies in Southeast Australia. So we have the wetland plant richness of forested richness curve, and we have the ion count, which is a reflection of oxidation or decomposition in wetland. And that is in turn a reflection of climate. So lower oxidation means the water level is high in the lake, and higher oxidation means the water level is low. And of course, the top is the macro charcoal, which shows fire activity in Cape or Bass Strait over the last 14,000 years. And here you can see that during period of dry conditions, you can see that the lake levels were low, and of course during wetter condition, the lake level was high, reflecting the low of climate. And also we can see that when the condition was dry, the richness was high, and when it became wetter, the richness was low. So that means when the lake were drying up, you have plants encroaching into the lake, so you have more floristic richness. And as the lake begins to become wet, it's going to drown the plants, and you have less plant richness around the lake. And of course, you can see this also reflecting the climatic conditions in the past. That it was dry here, wet, and then dry since the mid-Holocene. And also what we can see here is that when fire activity was actually low in the late glacier, we had high floristic richness, and also during the mid to late Holocene, there was high floristic richness. And when fire activity was very high, floristic richness was low. So it means moderate levels of fire or low levels of fire is actually maintaining optimum floristic richness in the wetland. And high fire activity, or when the fire becomes too much, we kind of reduce the floristic richness. And another thing to note is that at the same time, so here there were indigenous people around this time. So I'll be talking about that a bit. So there were indigenous people here, and as we can see that it is possible that indigenous burning at this time actually reduce wetland vegetation. So they were burning the surface of the wetland to actually prevent vegetation from covering it in order to promote freshwater richness, freshwater resources for their needs. And as indigenous land use actually declined through the Holocene, you can see that the wetland actually became dry. So that will have contributed to the dryness, that is, reduced indigenous fire usage, promoted more plants or more vegetation covering the surface of the wetland. Okay. So here, furthermore on the MPP case, so here we extracted the dung fungi or the poo fungi from the MPP record. And dung fungi actually associated with the poo of large herbivores and stuff like that, so like kangaroo, wallabies, and so on and so forth. So they can be used to actually track their presence on the landscape, and their presence can also be associated with human activity. So indirectly, they are used to actually interpret or to infer human land use on the landscape. Also, if you see where we rear a lot of cattle, of course, you will see a lot of dung fungi there. So the core for dung fungi was actually extracted from the record, from the Bass Strait record, and then compared with other data to understand human land use on the island or on Cape Island during the Holocene. So here we have the dung fungi curve, and the images here or the drawings here shows a wooded landscape here and a shrubby landscape, and this lot of large herbivores and declining large herbivores. And this is the radiocarbon dated evidence of human occupation in the past. Of course, the constructed wetland water level, sea level, as well as climate variability, and so. And here, archaeological study already suggests that the human occupation declined on the landscape 5,000 years ago, but we'll try to see if we can see that in our data, and our data sort of support that. Here, as you can see, there was increase in dung fungi and decline after 5,000 years ago. Anyway, so this suggests that at this period when indigenous people were on the landscape, they were using fire to actually promote an open vegetation to encourage more herbivore grazing, because the herbivore prefer fresh growth, so to increase fresh growth, so they were using fires to actually promote a condition that would be favorable for herbivore grazing and hunting. So, and after that period, when the land use declined, you can see also that Ogophilous fungi or dung fungi actually declined at that time. And also the vegetation during that period is more shrubby, which might not be suitable for herbivore around that time. And also we can see that during this period of major indigenous land use, the wetlands or the climate was wetter. So that means more food, more freshwater availability. And moving to this phase of high sea level when the island was actually shrinking and climate variability was increasing, that is, the climatic condition was becoming drier. Of course, a decline in food, decline in freshwater would have discouraged frequent use of the highland. So, in a nutshell, our findings here kind of support the fact that there was a major decline in land use on the island from about 5,000 years ago. Okay. Yeah. So enough of the Bass Strait. So now we move into a regional context, that is Southeast Australia as a whole. So here we try to understand what drove ecosystem change in Southeast Australia over the last 13,000 years. And to do that, the first thing we did was to calibrate pollen as a proxy for vegetation change, and also calibrate pollen as a proxy for changes in floristic richness. So to calibrate it, for those calibrations, we selected sampling site here in the yellow shaded region or areas. So vegetation survey data were actually collected from this region, as well as pollen data, surface pollen. And both vegetation data and surface pollen data were then compared, as we can see here, to establish a relationship or to see the relationship between them. And as you can see, there's a positive relationship between pollen and the vegetation, showing that changes in pollen assemblage equals to changes in vegetation. So that's what this is reflecting, that you have a vegetation here, and you can see that the vegetation here is similar to this, and the dissimilarity tends to increase. And this figure here is kind of metrics that we actually arrived at that shows that once the SDT, the square distance, that is the distance between pollen samples or vegetation samples, once they hit or they go above this particular number, it means there's a complete change in the vegetation. And once they are below that number, it means the vegetation is more or less similar. And so the cutoff of 5% here is like a standard to identify a significant change in this respect. And also for floristic richness, it shows that there is a positive relationship between pollen and plant richness. So that's established. So since we established that, we then applied this to fossil records in Southeast Australia. And in total, 24 fossil records were selected. So here is the Southeast Australia region results. So the black curve is showing the changes in vegetation through time, that is vegetation turnover. And everything above 0.2, which is the metric here, is equals to complete change in vegetation. So we have it for the mainland, the Bass Strait, and Tasmania. So the shaded portion here is a record of human occupation, which I'll be talking about later. And we compared those changes in floristic richness and vegetation turnover or vegetation change with records of climate. And as you can see here, using a generalized linear model. So it shows that across Southeast, or in most part of Southeast Australia, precipitation and sea level was the major driver of vegetation turnover. As you can see here in the center, and in terms of richness, sea level was found to be the major driver of floristic richness, and as opposed to the northern hemisphere where temperature is the major deal, especially during the polar season. But in Southeast Australia here, it's basically precipitation changes and sea level changes driving ecosystem changes. So we went on to test the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So we want to know how, if fire actually drove biodiversity in Australia in the past. So the concept of intermediate disturbance hypothesis actually is that during moderate levels of disturbance, you have optimum diversity, that is maximum diversity. And when disturbance level is too low or is too high, you have low biodiversity. So we then apply that to the fossil pollen record and charcoal record for Southeast Australia. So the charcoal record is representing the disturbance, fire, and of course the biological richness is representing the diversity. And we can see the pattern is so strong on the Bass Strait, reflecting that the indigenous people or indigenous managed spawning actually maintain high biodiversity in the past. We can see some of that also in Tasmania. And the trend here in Southeast Mainland is probably as a result of the low data quality from the site compared to the other two sites that had high data quality. Okay, so that's about the driver of vegetation in Southeast Australia. So now moving to the fire. So here we try to understand the role of humans and climate in fire regimes in Southeast Australia in the past. And to do that, we separated fire regime into biomass bonds and fire frequency. So biomass bond is the vegetation consumed by landscape fire. And the proxy for that is the total charcoal on the landscape. While the fire frequency is the peak of this biomass burning, or the peak of this fire activities, the frequency of the peaks. So we selected 79 charcoal records across Southeast Australia, and of course, using the Bass Strait as a main reference point. So here in Bass Strait, you can see, so this is the biomass bonds, the dark shaded portions. So that's the total landscape fire. And the peak, the red ones are the peaks. And the frequency of those peaks represent the fire frequency. So here we have a composite curve for Bass Strait, showing the composite of everything here. So the gray area shows biomass bonds, and you can see, and the broken line shows fire frequency through time. So this exercise was also conducted to other parts of Southeast Australia, including Western Tasmania, the Furnace Group, which is the Bass Strait, and of course the Southeast Mainland. And then we compared the amount of biomass bonds and fire frequency to record of climate and human occupation using a generalized linear model. And we found that climate was actually the major driver for biomass bonds in the past. That is the amount of vegetation consumed by fire. While human activities were actually responsible for how frequent the fire was. So in other words, so human activities, we found that if you can see in the Furnace Group that when human activities was high, that is when fire frequency, so fire frequency now equates human activities. As you can see here in the Bass Strait, when fire frequency was high, as well as human activity, biomass burning was low. So probably when the condition became wetter, that it could feed the vegetation to become denser for more fire to burn. So indigenous frequent burning was actually suppressing the biomass fuel on the landscape to reduce the risk of large biomass burning. And as fire frequency declined, you can see that biomass burning actually increased. So I will explain that for that here. So here, the biomass burns through time is actually plotted against moisture gradient. And as you can see here for Southeast Australia vegetation, so in a typical wet forest, you have low chances of fire. And as the condition become drier, you can see that fire tends to increase. That is when moisture begins to decrease. And here, reduced moisture in dry forest increases the chance of fire. And at a point, if moisture continues to increase, the woodland becomes more open, reducing the chances of fire movement across the landscape. And if you increase such moisture further, the open woodland will become even more open, reducing the chances of fire burning across the landscape. So here, fire is a function of how close or how dense the vegetation is. It's not the chances of ignition happening, but how dense the vegetation is that can actually allow fire to rage across the landscape easily. So here, the broken line represents the role of indigenous people of frequent fire usage. So in a typical wet forest, well, it might not do much, but once the forest becomes dry, the fire chances are increasing. So when you introduce frequent indigenous burning or frequent fire usage, you reduce the fuel of the dry forest to become open, reducing the chances of fire. And when the vegetation becomes woody here, which is more likely to burn, and you introduce indigenous or frequent burning, which reduces the biomass load in the woodland, making it open and reducing the chances of fire. And so on and so forth. If you increase here, also if you introduce indigenous burning, it just makes the vegetation open further. So this shaded area is what I call the critical zone, where we actually need to manage indigenous burning most, which is the case of Southeast Australia now. So the majority of the vegetation where, or the areas where we're having the catastrophic fire, are characterized by this kind of vegetation. And introducing this kind of frequent burning to reduce the amount of fire, biomass load or biomass fuel on the landscape can actually reduce the chances of catastrophic fire in the future. Okay. So sequel to that, we went on to ask that one I just talked about, talks about what happened over the last 12,000 years. So now focusing on what happened in the last 700 years to see the differences between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial fire regimes. So we also selected charcoal records across Southeast Australia mainland. And in this case, it's a total of about 61 records. And the areas where the last bushfire occurred, which are actually highlighted in red. So we compare the charcoal record from Southeast Australia mainland. We compare the record of our vegetation change, that is turnover, as well as precipitation, temperature, and ENSO, to understand what was the major driver of biomass burning or fire activities during colonial period and before colonial period. And firstly, one thing we found is that there was a major increase in biomass burn during post-colonial period, especially since 1850. And we also found that vegetation change and precipitation change was the major driver of biomass burn during this period. So here, we believe that indigenous people promoted an open landscape. And since colonial period, when indigenous activities were stopped, forest areas became denser, woodland areas became denser, and of course, already open landscape in some areas where the Europeans colonized continue to be open. But of course, the forests that became denser is the main thing. So those dense vegetation allowed more fire to burn on the landscape, increasing the chances of widespread fire. And followed by that is precipitation, which is also making things worse. So the drier condition, the increase in fire weather occurrence is also making the fire worse, making catastrophic fire more frequent. So with that, in summary, we can say that climate actually drove ecosystem changes in Australia in the past, and at least over the last 12,000 years, sea level and precipitation was a major factor. So precipitation in this case can be related to ENSO, and it can be related to southern westerly winds. Those two climatic modes also drive precipitation regimes in Southeast Australia. And of course, indigenous burning maintained an open landscape in the past. And of course, climate and anthropogenic burning drove fire regimes, but indigenous frequent usage of fire in the past actually suppressed reduce the chance of catastrophic fire happening in the past, which have been caused by climate. And suppression of indigenous burning over the last 200 years actually battered damaging fires in Southeast Australia. So for recommendation, frequent managed burning in heatlands can actually help maintain the ecosystem, to preserve their structure and preserve their diversity, keeping them short and short. And of course, carefully managed burning can also be used to maintain floristic richness as well as hydrology in wetland. And what else? Yeah, this is the main deal. Introduction or the introduction of indigenous managed burning to actually reduce the potential occurrence of damaging fires in Southeast Australia in the future. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my sources of support, especially my supervisory members, as well as acknowledge my collaborators, both in Australia and outside Australia. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was incredibly detailed and diverse mapping proxy tool. It's incredible the results you've got from those records. We do have time for a few questions. If anyone wants to raise any questions, comments, discussion. If you've got people online that you can see.
Yeah, monitoring.
Start just quickly. The records you've got are just incredible for really detailing the, the start and the finish of the last glacial maximum and the responses to that. In really detailed fashion. It's incredible. With the records you've got, all these lakes and lagoons, is there any reason why you think that they don't go past 35,000 years? Is there any kind of climatic drivers for that?
No, the first limiting factor is the kind of equipment that you have. So the kind of equipment that we use can only go to that depth. So if we get like a more heavy machinery, we can go 1,000 meters.
Oh, okay. So
yeah.
you just gotta get it there.
Yeah.
I have a very simple question for you. When you're talking about the floristic richness of your wetland sites, is that the biodiversity of the wetlands, or is that the total number of species? Or
yeah, the total number of species.
So individuals, in species, not individuals. You know what I mean? Species richness, not individual richness.
No, not individual richness. Species richness.
That's really interesting.
Any other questions here online?
I might have one question about one of the slides about fire, but I'm not sure if that's relevant. Forward. Yeah, that one.
This one?
No, the previous one.
Yeah.
Like if I understood correctly, you said that the plot is pretty much the average of all these readings.
Yeah.
Different regions.
Yeah, like composite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happens, or would it be interesting to look at specific regions separately, or
No, you mean this?
all like these?
So this is individual sites.
Yeah.
And the curve here is a composite of all of the sites. So this site is a region. That's the Bass Strait area. And the next slide actually shows individual region. So these are the individual regions. So this is the mainland, Southeast Australia, which is basically Victoria and New South Wales.
Yeah.
And here is Bass Strait and Western Tasmania.
Yeah, like my question would be how refined you could go. Like, would it be useful to look at specific sites instead of the average?
Yeah, you can look at specific site. Depends on the scale of study. Like, so what we are interested in looking at a regional pattern and not individual pattern. So, and so for those who might be interested in individual sites, that's why this is provided, because my study sites or my PhD focus on Bass Strait. So I have individual sites for that, and moreover, the composite is showing a major trend. So there can be local variability. So, for example, you can have out of 10 sites, you can have 2 sites showing the opposite, or the composite is showing what most of the sites are actually telling us. Yeah.
Interesting to, there's some studies being done on the remains animal from sites. University of Tasmania are kind of studying the current marsupial populations, bird populations, and so on these islands. How do you think that, I mean, you've got the coprophyllus fungi showing some potential decline. Do you think there's potential for extinctions or changing animal populations as well? Could be further explored.
Yeah, like I think you're referring to McDowell, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I would expect that this part of the record that there will be a lot of bones that belongs to larger before, like kangaroos, wallabies, and some other. And I would expect that that should decline through time, and then maybe in the last couple of 100 years, when major indigenous occupation resumed on the islands, then they should increase again. But indigenous people started managing the woodland to keep them open and more habitable for this habitat. So I would expect an increase in decline and then an increase, something like that. So, and I think based on what Marco said, he said he saw a lot of maybe rats, some like small mammals, a lot of them here. I don't remember what he saw, maybe they were large or something. Said a lot of small mammals, not large mammals, during the Holocene, late Holocene. So which would be not enough to eat.
It'll be an interesting thing to follow up, maybe. Combining those two on the record.
Yeah.
That's good.
I had a dumb question quickly about charcoal. So just the slide back, or forward maybe, the one, so when you're talking about biomass burned and frequency of fires.
Yes.
So you're looking at fire frequency as the kind of occurrence of charcoal in each core at each period of time. Is that like how often things are burning from your record?
Yeah, but the peak of charcoal. So
Maximum the whole record.
yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so how many times that maximum, like how many maximums there are, or is that kind of, or is it overall? I suppose I'm just
No,
asking
yeah,
how
once you run the chart analysis, so it spits out the peak frequency. From the peak frequency, you can see what the fire frequency looks like. So I took that in each record and then took an average. So I did a mean and a median to make sure we are telling the same thing. Yeah.
And then the biomass burned, is that from just the numbers of charcoal at each, in each?
Yeah,
in
the
each period of
total,
time?
yeah, the total amount of charcoal in a sample. Yeah. So the biomass bond is what some people will call the background char, and the fire frequency is the charcoal peaks. Yeah.
I suppose my question is just in the next slide, you have kind of, is that what you expect to see based on just climate, and then below it's what you actually see because people were managing the landscape, or is
You
it
mean
kind of
me?
just a, yeah?
Yeah. So
that's-
this is not. So I didn't invent this. So it's already an existing framework by Brascock, and some were adapted by the farmers. So I just kind of edited it. So this is already existing, and in fact, something similar has been done in the US, where they found indigenous people at fire frequency or frequent fire usage, reducing the chances of fire. So based on what I'm seeing here in Bass Strait as the reference point, and don't forget, human occupation was continuous here and here, so it's difficult to actually tell if people or climate was actually doing that. So that's why the Bass Strait is more reliable to actually decipher the role of humans and climate. So the Bass Strait record actually kind of motivated what's happening here. And as you can see, when biomass was low, people using frequent fire to reduce biomass, and as that reduced, biomass fire actually increased. And the low fire frequency and biomass here is it's probably the influence of sea level, because when sea level actually became a major problem on the island, of course, it changed the vegetation to heathland, which was probably open and sparse and producing less charcoal. So that's what you see. The increase in biomass burning here and low fire frequency could be attached to the fact that when European people came and probably suppressed the the cultural activities of the low number or probably the remaining indigenous people on the island. So suppressing that kind of also increased biomass burning. Even in this case, due to high sea level, drier climate, of course, biomass fuel accumulation will be low at this time. And then Charlie towards here, even though it was still dry, there's not much wetness for vegetation to grow. But once the vegetation accumulates enough, it was probably burning really intensely.
See how difficult this is to distain. My mind is snapping just thinking about it. Like,
Mm.
because you have climate changing things, but you have
Yeah.
people changing things as the climate is changing things. So
Yeah.
it's kind of, you might be picking up a signal that is people, but it is also climate.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the model here is not saying, so here I'm not saying that just people is driving fire frequency, just that many so other climatic factors, as you can see, they also contribute. Yeah. Just that the model is speaking of humans as the major driving factor. So
Very interesting.
Some last questions? Right, thank you very much.